The night the fire threat came to Harlem. Harlem had seen threats before. It had heard whispers in alleyways, watched patrol cars slow down a little too long at certain corners, felt the tension of eyes that did not belong. But this time the threat did not hide in a whisper. It came in ink. Thick black letters across a folded paper slipped under the door of a small church on 138th Street. It carried no signature, only a message sharp enough to cut through the quiet dignity of Sunday hymns. Burn it down. Reverend Powell did not tremble when he read it. His hands were steady, though his heart beat with the knowledge that threats like these did not arrive alone. They arrived with gasoline, with rope, with men who believed fear was a language God understood. The church was more than wood and stained glass. It was the spine of the neighborhood. It held baptisms, funerals, food drives, whispered prayers from mothers who had nowhere else to cry. Burning it would not just destroy a building, it would attempt to erase hope. Powell folded the letter carefully, not crumpling it, not tearing it. He believed composure was the first defense against chaos. But composure did not mean isolation. Harlem was not a place where men stood alone when fire approached. And if there was one man who understood the mathematics of power, the psychology of intimidation, and the art of calculated response, it was Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy's club did not advertise protection. It did not hang banners declaring safety. But the people knew something the newspapers never printed. When storms formed over Harlem, Bumpy did not look away. He observed, he measured, and when necessary, he moved. The club that evening pulsed with low jazz and cigarette smoke curling toward the ceiling like slow-burning thoughts. Conversations were layered, business, rumors, laughter that masked deeper calculations. Bumpy sat at his usual table, not in the center of the room, but in control of it. His presence did not demand attention, it redirected it. He wore discipline the way other men wore suits. When Reverend Powell stepped inside, conversations shifted subtly, not because he was feared, but because he did not belong in a place like this at that hour. A man of the cloth crossing into a world of shadows meant something serious had crossed the threshold of peace. Powell did not waste words. He did not dramatize. He simply placed the folded letter on Bumpy's table. Bumpy read it once, then again. His face did not harden. It did not flare with anger. Instead, it became still, the kind of stillness that meant gears were turning behind the eyes. He understood something most hot-headed men never learned. Threats are not solved by emotion. They are solved by understanding who benefits from the fire. "Who else has seen this?" Bumpy asked quietly. "No one," Powell replied. "Not yet." That answer mattered. Panic spreads faster than flame. Bumpy leaned back slightly, absorbing the weight of what the letter represented. Racism was not new, but organized intimidation meant someone wanted spectacle, someone wanted smoke rising over Harlem as a message. Bumpy's power did not lie in fists, it lay in influence. He knew store owners, barbers, porters, teachers, men who worked docks, men who watched corners. Harlem had eyes, and those eyes respected him not because he shouted, but because he kept his word. "You don't fight fire with noise," Bumpy said finally. "You fight it with presence." Powell did not ask what that meant. He understood leadership when he saw it. He had sermons, Bumpy had strategy. Both protected souls in different ways. That night, Bumpy did not send men with gasoline of their own. He did not escalate. He did something more powerful. He began making quiet calls, conversations that sounded casual but carried weight. He spoke to men who once had nothing but found dignity through discipline. He reminded them of something deeper than retaliation, responsibility. By midnight, Harlem had shifted, not in chaos, in awareness. Men who normally spent evenings at cards or corners began walking different routes.
not armed for battle, but present, observant, calm, the kind of presence that tells aggressors their surprise has expired. What Powell expected was anger. What he witnessed instead was organization. The following evening, the church doors opened for prayer as usual. Candles were lit, hymns began softly, but outside something else was happening. 40 men, not gangsters in the caricature sense, but barbers, fathers, veterans, laborers, stood scattered across the surrounding streets. They did not shout, they did not threaten, they simply stood. And that changed everything. Because intimidation feeds on isolation, but that night, isolation did not exist. Cars that drove slowly past did not stop. Figures who might have approached reconsidered. The element of fear, the very oxygen of arson, was gone. In its place was unity, calm, watchfulness. Bumpy himself did not stand in front of the church. He understood symbolism. This was not about him. It was about Harlem protecting its own. He remained in the background, ensuring lines of communication remained open, ensuring no impulsive action erupted into the very chaos the threat-makers desired. Inside the church, Powell preached differently that night. Not about vengeance, not about enemies, but about courage that does not shout, about faith that stands its ground without swinging a fist. He did not mention the men outside. He did not need to. The fire never came, but something else did. Respect. Word traveled quietly beyond Harlem that intimidation had failed, that fear had been met not with retaliation, but with disciplined unity. And in that quiet victory, Bumpy demonstrated a form of strength rarely understood, power that prevents violence rather than performs it. Later that week, Powell visited Bumpy again, not with a letter this time, but gratitude. "You didn't send soldiers," Bumpy said. "No, I sent neighbors." That was the difference, because violence makes headlines, but presence rewrites history. And in Harlem, on that threatened night, the building remained standing, not because fire was impossible, but because unity made it unwelcome. This was not the end of the tension. Threats do not disappear nights overnight, but something had shifted. The people realized that protection did not always require chaos. Sometimes it required coordination, calm, leadership that sees 3 moves ahead. And as the smoke that never rose remained only a possibility in someone's failed imagination, Bumpy Johnson proved something powerful. Strength is not measured by how many weapons leave a room, but how many disasters never happen because discipline entered first.
The divide they tried to manufacture. The fire thread had failed, but failure does not discourage men who are invested in fear. It only forces them to change strategy. When intimidation from the outside does not fracture a community, those who thrive on division begin to look for cracks within. Harlem had stood together in the face of arson, but unity under visible danger is often easier than unity under suspicion. The new tactic would not arrive folded in a letter. It would arrive disguised as opportunity, whispered through unfamiliar voices, wrapped in money that seemed too convenient to question. Within 2 weeks of the threatened burning, rumors began to travel along the sidewalks like invisible threads. A group of businessmen, not local and not known, had begun offering loans to struggling shop owners at rates far below what banks would ever consider. At first glance, it looked like generosity. Barbershops that had barely survived the winter suddenly had access to new chairs. A grocer whose refrigerator had been failing could suddenly afford a replacement. Tailors were offered advances to expand their storefronts. It seemed like prosperity knocking at the door. But prosperity rarely arrives without expectation. The contracts were dense, written in language that most recipients did not fully understand, and buried within those pages were clauses that quietly shifted ownership if payments faltered even slightly. It was not a violent threat,
It was a financial snare, and its purpose was not immediate destruction, but slow capture. If enough storefronts fell under external control, the heart of Harlem would not need to be burned. It could be bought, reorganized, and reshaped from within. Bumpy Johnson noticed patterns before others did because he understood something critical. Pressure rarely attacks twice in the same form. He had spent years studying how power moves, and he knew that when brute force fails, subtle leverage replaces it. He began asking quiet questions, not accusing anyone, not sounding alarms. He visited shops under the pretense of casual conversation, leaning against counters, observing new equipment, listening carefully to the tone in a man's voice when he described his lucky break. What Bumpy heard beneath the optimism was something else: unease. One evening, in the back room of his club, he gathered a small group of trusted men, not enforcers, but thinkers, men who could read contracts, men who had served in the military and learned discipline, men who understood numbers better than fists. He laid copies of the loan agreements on the table and let silence fill the room before speaking. He did not accuse. He asked, "What do you see?" The answer came slowly. One clause here, a transfer condition there, a late payment trigger that allowed immediate takeover. It was clean, legal, almost elegant in its design. No threats, no gasoline, no mobs, just signatures that could quietly strip control from dozens of families. If enough businesses changed hands, the church would not need to be threatened again. It would stand surrounded by properties owned by men who did not value its presence. The brilliance of the scheme angered some in the room. Anger rose quickly because betrayal dressed as help feels personal. But Bumpy did not allow the room to heat. He let the frustration crest, then lowered it with a calm reminder. They want reaction. They want noise. They want us to look reckless. We will not give them that. Instead of confronting the lenders publicly, Bumpy and his small council designed something more powerful: education. They began hosting community meetings under the guise of financial literacy workshops. The events were framed not as warnings, but as empowerment sessions. Local accountants volunteered to explain contract language. Lawyers sympathetic to Harlem's survival broke down the fine print. They did not tell anyone what to do. They taught them how to understand. This shift was subtle but transformative. Shop owners who had been flattered by easy money began to reconsider. Some renegotiated. Others refused to sign entirely. A few who had already signed found technicalities that allowed them to withdraw. The outside investors, expecting rapid acquisition, found resistance instead. Not loud protest, but informed refusal. Their timeline began to unravel. Frustration from those orchestrating the scheme grew. When financial leverage did not produce swift compliance, they attempted another move: misinformation. Pamphlets began circulating anonymously, claiming that Bumpy himself was behind the loans, that he was manipulating the neighborhood for control. It was clever. If they could turn Harlem against its quiet strategist, the internal shield would collapse. Powell heard the whispers first from members of his congregation. There was confusion, even suspicion. Leadership is tested most harshly, not when enemies attack openly, but when allies begin to doubt. Powell did not rush to defend Bumpy publicly. He knew that defensive noise can sometimes legitimize baseless claims. Instead, he visited Bumpy privately. He placed one of the pamphlets on the table, just as he had once placed the threat letter. The symmetry was not lost on either man. Bumpy read the accusation carefully, not dismissing it with ego. He understood that perception can be as powerful as fact. He said quietly, "They want me loud. They want a spectacle." He stood, adjusted his jacket, and made a decision that surprised even Powell. Rather than deny the rumors through press or public confrontation, he would step back, temporarily. He would allow respected community figures, teachers, veterans, clergy, to lead the financial education efforts without his visible presence. It was a strategic retreat, not from responsibility, from visibility. By removing himself from the center of the narrative, he deprived the misinformation campaign of oxygen. The workshops continued, contracts were scrutinized, and the community slowly recognized the pattern on its own. Trust rebuilt, not through declarations, but through results. Meanwhile, the investors found themselves stalled. Acquisition targets dwindled. Their prior takeover faced resistance they had not anticipated, a neighborhood that could read its own paperwork. The elegance of their trap became useless when its mechanisms were exposed. Without violence, without protest marches, without retaliation, Harlem had neutralized a financial siege. But the lesson ran deeper than stopping a scheme. The community had learned something about itself. It discovered that unity was not only physical presence outside a church at night, it was shared knowledge during daylight. It was discipline in meetings. It was patience in response. And through it all, Bumpy remained consistent, not as a hero in headlines, but as a stabilizing force that preferred prevention over performance. One late evening, as the club quieted after closing, Powell joined Bumpy for a final conversation about the ordeal. There was no celebration, only reflection. They tried fire, then they tried paper, Powell said. And they will try something else, Bumpy replied evenly. There was no arrogance in his tone, only awareness. Outside, Harlem moved as it always had, children running, music drifting from windows, elders sitting on stoops with stories layered across decades. The buildings still stood, the shops still bore local names, the church bells still rang. But beneath the surface, something had strengthened. The neighborhood no longer relied solely on reactive courage. It had developed strategic foresight. The second attack had not come with flames, but it had carried the potential to erase identity just as thoroughly. And it had been met with something even more powerful than watchful men in the street. It had been met with collective intelligence. Bumpy understood that leadership is rarely about standing in front of danger with raised fists. More often, it is about standing slightly to the side, guiding others to see what is coming before it arrives. In that quiet guidance, Harlem found not only protection, but confidence. They were no longer simply surviving threats, they were anticipating them. And somewhere beyond the visible streets, those who had attempted to fracture Harlem realized an unsettling truth. Intimidation had failed, financial manipulation had failed, and rumor had failed. The community was not reacting impulsively, it was thinking. The night the church was threatened proved Harlem could stand together. The weeks that followed proved it could think together. And for men who relied on chaos, that combination was far more dangerous than any weapon ever carried.
The price of control. Pressure, when it fails to intimidate and fails to deceive, begins to negotiate. That was the next evolution. Harlem had resisted fear and refused the financial snare, and the men who had tried both tactics were not accustomed to losing quietly. They were accustomed to leverage. They understood systems, influence, reputation, and if Harlem could not be burned or bought, perhaps it could be isolated. The shift began subtly, almost invisibly. Permits that had once moved routinely through city offices began to stall. Inspection schedules became unusually frequent. A jazz venue was cited for minor code violations that had gone unnoticed for years. A bakery was temporarily shut down for a paperwork discrepancy that would have once warranted a simple warning. None of these actions were catastrophic on their own, but together they formed a pattern, a tightening of administrative pressure designed to exhaust rather than explode. Bumpy noticed the pattern immediately because he recognized strategy when he saw it. This was no longer about direct confrontation, it was about erosion.
If businesses were forced to spend money correcting endless infractions, if churches were delayed in renovation approvals, if community events were suddenly burdened by bureaucratic hurdles, morale would slowly weaken. A community drained by paperwork has little energy left for unity. What made this tactic particularly dangerous was its legitimacy. There were no letters threatening arson, no suspicious loan clauses, just official stamps and procedural authority. Fighting it recklessly would only reinforce the narrative that Harlem was unstable. Responding emotionally would provide justification for further scrutiny. One afternoon, Bumpy received an invitation delivered not by messenger, but by an impeccably dressed intermediary who introduced himself as a consultant representing interested parties. The meeting was requested at a neutral downtown office, far from Harlem's pulse. The message was polite, the implication was not. When Bumpy arrived, he did not bring an entourage, he did not project aggression. He entered the room composed, carrying nothing but his awareness. Across the table sat two men whose suits were tailored to suggest power without displaying it. Their language was careful, professional, almost courteous. They did not accuse Harlem of defiance. They spoke instead of integration, economic realignment, and future stability. Then they made the offer. If Bumpy would step back from his informal influence in community organization, if he would discourage collective resistance and instead promote cooperation with outside development interests, certain administrative pressures could ease. Permits would flow again, inspections would relax, investment capital would return, this time structured more fairly. In return, Harlem would slowly open its doors to ownership shifts that placed key properties under external management. It would be gradual, clean, and framed as progress. The offer was not a threat, it was a transaction. And in that transaction lay the true test, because accepting would not immediately harm the neighborhood. In fact, it might relieve the current strain. Businesses would breathe easier, events would proceed smoothly, there would be applause for compromise, but beneath that relief would lie surrender, not dramatic, not violent, but permanent. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He asked questions not to challenge, but to clarify. He wanted them to say it plainly, to articulate the cost of compliance. And when the conversation concluded, he stood without raising his voice. He did not argue ideology. He simply said, "You are asking me to trade tomorrow for comfort today." He left the building with no agreement signed, no public declaration made. The choice now rested on his shoulders alone. He could quietly accept, rationalize it as necessary adaptation, and Harlem would never know the details. Or he could refuse and prepare the community for continued pressure. That evening, instead of retreating into isolation, Bumpy did something that revealed the depth of his leadership. He called a closed meeting, not of loyalists, not of men who owed him favors, but of varied voices. Shop owners who had suffered inspections, clergy who felt the administrative strain, young activists eager for change, elder statesmen cautious from decades of struggle. He did not frame the meeting as a dramatic crossroads. He presented the situation as it was, a proposal offering relief at a cost that might not be visible immediately. The discussion lasted hours. Some argued that relief was necessary. Others feared long-term dependency. There were moments when tension rose, when accusations of stubborn pride surfaced. But Bumpy did not dominate the conversation. He listened. He asked. He allowed disagreement to breathe, because unity forged through forced consensus is fragile. What emerged by the end of the night was not unanimous certainty, but shared clarity. The cost of compliance was autonomy. The relief offered was temporary, and while continued pressure would be exhausting, it would at least be faced on their own terms. The following weeks were not easy. Inspections continued, paperwork multiplied. There were nights when exhaustion tempted reconsideration, but something remarkable occurred under strain. Collaboration deepened. businesses began sharing legal resources. Churches coordinated event permits collectively to reduce vulnerability. Young volunteers assisted elders in navigating bureaucratic requirements. Instead of fracturing, the community became more interconnected. Bumpy did not publicize his refusal. He did not reveal the downtown meeting. Leadership sometimes means absorbing temptation privately so that others are not burdened by it. But word travels in ways no strategy fully controls. Eventually, whispers reached Harlem that an offer had been made and declined. When the truth surfaced, not dramatically but gradually, it altered perception. People realized that protection had extended beyond visible threats and financial traps. It had extended into moral territory. Bumpy had been offered a path to ease, to reduced scrutiny, perhaps even personal gain, and he declined it without spectacle. That realization did not elevate him into myth, it grounded him in trust. Meanwhile, the external forces reassessed. Administrative pressure requires justification. When inspections consistently uncover little beyond minor infractions, when public complaints are absent, when cooperation remains professional despite strain, the narrative of instability weakens. Over time, scrutiny softened, not as a gift, but as a practical retreat from an unproductive tactic. One late evening, Powell visited Bumpy once again. There were no letters this time, no pamphlets, no contracts, just conversation. Powell observed that resistance had matured. "We're not reacting anymore," he said thoughtfully. "We're anticipating." Bumpy nodded slowly. Power isn't loud, it's patient. The third wave of pressure had not come with flames or forged signatures. It had come with an offer designed to test character. And in declining it, Bumpy demonstrated something that resonated far beyond Harlem. Control is not about dominating others. It is about mastering oneself when compromise is tempting. The church still stood, the businesses still bore local names, the music still drifted into warm summer nights, but beneath the surface, a deeper transformation had taken place. Harlem no longer defined itself solely by resilience against attack. It defined itself by conscious choice. There would always be forces seeking influence. There would always be negotiations disguised as opportunity. But now the community had seen its own strength under three different forms of pressure: intimidation, manipulation, and temptation. And each time it had responded not with chaos, but with cohesion. The threats had changed shape 3 times, and each time the response had grown more refined.
When the shield becomes the standard. The final test did not arrive as a threat, a contract, or a closed-door offer. It arrived as absence. After months of calculated pressure, subtle manipulation, and restrained resistance, Harlem had grown stronger in ways that were not immediately visible to the outside world. But strength that rests too heavily on one figure can become fragile if that figure is removed. And whether by coincidence or design, that moment came when Bumpy Johnson was called away from Harlem for an extended legal matter that required his presence outside the neighborhood he had quietly stabilized. There were no dramatic arrests, no public spectacle attached to his departure. It was procedural, bureaucratic, almost dull in presentation. But for those who understood influence, it was strategic timing. Remove the stabilizer and watch the structure. That was the experiment. Those who had failed to fracture Harlem directly now wanted to observe whether unity was organic or merely anchored to one man's discipline. When word spread that Bumpy would be absent for weeks, speculation stirred. Some wondered if pressure would intensify again. Others feared that old tensions might resurface without his quiet coordination. And a few, more cynical voices from outside the neighborhood predicted that internal conflicts would finally erupt. After all, communities that rely too heavily on a single strategist often unravel when he is no longer present to guide the tempo.
But what had been built over the previous months was not dependence, it was infrastructure. The workshops, the shared legal resources, the habit of collective meetings, the normalization of calm response, all of it had shifted the cultural reflex. Harlem had learned how to respond before reacting. That lesson did not vanish with one man's temporary absence. Powell sensed the significance of the moment immediately. He did not frame Bumpy's departure as a crisis. During Sunday service, he spoke not of vulnerability, but of stewardship. He reminded the congregation that protection was never meant to rest on one pair of shoulders. He spoke of distributed responsibility, of each neighbor acting as a quiet guardian of the other. It was not rhetoric, it was reinforcement of what had already been practiced. Within days, minor provocations began to surface, subtle probes testing whether discipline would falter. A heated dispute between two business owners over shared delivery routes threatened to escalate into public argument. In the past, such tension might have drawn factions. Instead, a small mediation group, formed months earlier during the financial literacy meetings, stepped in calmly, listened to both sides, and proposed a structured compromise. The conflict dissolved before it could ripple outward. Elsewhere, a rumor circulated that certain shops would face renewed inspection waves. Rather than panic, the business collective organized a preemptive review session, ensuring compliance and sharing updated guidelines. When inspectors arrived, they found readiness rather than resistance. The attempt to create stress through unpredictability failed because unpredictability had already been anticipated. What surprised outside observers most was not the absence of chaos, but the absence of ego-driven replacement. No one stepped forward to declare themselves the new center. No loud personality attempted to claim control. Instead, leadership appeared distributed, quiet, collaborative, procedural. The culture had matured beyond personality. It had become practice. One evening, weeks into Bumpy's absence, a community gathering was held in the same church once threatened with flames. The event was not defensive, it was celebratory, though understated. Music filled the hall, food was shared, and stories were exchanged about the challenges overcome in recent months. There was laughter not born of denial, but of earned confidence. The building that had once been a target now symbolized resilience sustained without spectacle. During the gathering, Powell addressed the crowd briefly. He did not mention enemies, he did not mention threats. Instead, he spoke of transformation. He acknowledged that what had begun as reaction to danger had evolved into proactive unity. We are no longer responding to pressure, we are setting the tone. That shift from reaction to tone setting marked the true victory. Outside Harlem, those who had studied the neighborhood with strategic interest began to reassess again. Removing the perceived anchor had not triggered instability. If anything, it had revealed a deeper layer of cohesion. The tactics that once seemed promising, intimidation, financial entrapment, bureaucratic strain, now appeared inefficient against a culture that had internalized discipline. Pressure thrives on fragmentation. Harlem was no longer fragmented. When Bumpy finally returned, there was no parade awaiting him, no dramatic display of relief. The streets looked as they always had, alive, layered, imperfect, vibrant. That normalcy was the greatest affirmation. It meant that the shield had become standard. What he had once helped coordinate was now instinctive. He visited the church quietly, sitting in the back pew during an afternoon service. He observed the rhythm of the congregation, the steady confidence in Powell's voice, the unspoken assurance in the way neighbors greeted one another. Afterward, he stepped outside and walked the surrounding blocks alone. He saw new compliance notices framed proudly in shop windows, evidence not of submission, but of preparedness. He saw young men assisting elders with paperwork. He saw collaboration where once might have been isolated effort. That evening, back at his club, a few close associates asked whether he had worried during his absence. He responded without theatrics. If strength depends on one man, it isn't strength, it's convenience. Harlem, he realized, had moved beyond convenience. It had embraced ownership of its own stability. The final challenge did not require confrontation, it required proof, and the proof was clear. Unity sustained in the absence of its most visible strategist was unity that could not easily be dismantled. The attempts to fracture Harlem had inadvertently refined it. Each wave of pressure had forced adaptation. Each tactic had strengthened coordination. What began with a letter threatening flames had evolved into a cultural transformation. The building still stood, yes, but more importantly, the mindset had shifted. Fear no longer dictated tempo. Reaction no longer defined identity. Strategy, patience, and shared responsibility had become embedded habits. In the months that followed, external pressures gradually receded, not because opposition had surrendered entirely, but because resistance without chaos is difficult to exploit. There were no headlines celebrating victory. There were no public declarations of triumph. The triumph was quieter than that. It was found in uninterrupted Sunday services, in businesses operating under local names, in disputes resolved through dialogue rather than division. Harlem had proven something that extended beyond its streets. Protection is most powerful when it evolves into culture. A single act of defense can inspire. A pattern of disciplined response can stabilize. But when an entire community internalizes that discipline, it becomes resilient in ways that no external tactic can easily undermine. Bumpy did not claim credit for what had occurred. He understood that influence is strongest when it fades into collective identity. The greatest evidence of leadership is not how loudly one is remembered, but how effectively others function without constant direction. The threats had tested Harlem's courage. The financial traps had tested its awareness. The tempting offer had tested its integrity. The absence had tested its independence. And through each stage, the community had not merely survived, it had matured. In the end, the story was not about 40 men standing guard, nor about one strategist outmaneuvering opponents. It was about transformation. It was about a neighborhood learning that dignity defended with patience can outlast intimidation delivered with force. It was about understanding that strength is not a moment of confrontation, but a sustained commitment to unity. And as the church bells continued to ring over streets that had once braced for fire, they no longer rang in warning, they rang in confirmation. Harlem had become its own shield.